Thank you, Father. Thank you very much, Father. I'll write that website up on the dry erase board. So that website is www.monte, M-O-N-T-E, Cristo, C-H-R-I-S-T-O, .net. So Father mentioned a couple of things with regard to reclamation theology, and I think that's where I kind of want to start today. We're going to talk about spiritual warfare, spiritual combat, but from a reclamation theology standpoint, it is to reclaim that theology which was tradition, which we had always, what has the church always said? And how did those various topics develop over the centuries? And the reason that this is important to to spiritual warfare is there's an element that we've come to know that Father and I are talking about. When I say Father, I'm referring to Father Ripperger. But we're looking at and doing case and data evaluation. There's a principle that we find is universal, and that is the principle of psychological compatibility. So let's talk about that for just a moment. What is psychological compatibility? An example, a functional example of psychological compatibility is all of you sitting here. You have a common interest. And so if you didn't have the common interest to a great specificity, you wouldn't be sitting in South Carolina on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in a parish hall listening to this talk. So that's what draws you together, psychological compatibility. All relationships are based on a concept of psychological compatibility. We identify those people that we think may be psychologically compatible with us by the way they dress, by the way what they drive, how they act, and in modern society, whether or not they wear a mask, what are their bumper stickers on their back of their car. All of these things are indicators that there may be a possible compatibility. And then we strike up a conversation. The diabolical does this by projection. And so when I use the term projection, this is not and I'll talk about projecting into the cosmos. So let's clarify some terms. That's not a New Age concept. You know that as prayer. So first of all, what is cosmos? The way I'm using it, cosmos is what God brings out of chaos. Cosmos means order. And so it's an order out of disorder. And so when you project, we call that prayer. Projection is the method of communication between a non-corporal being. Angels communicate by projection. They tempt you by projection. So what is that? Is they will a concept. Their faculties are limited to intellect and will. And so we're going to use a very simplified Thomistic schema of the human person, talking about 5 faculties and the necessity to keep those faculties ordered. The highest 2 faculties are intellect and will. The angel is limited to intellect and will. You have intellect and will. These faculties are reserved to your soul. They are not corporal faculties. Corporal being of the corpus, of the body. So an angel brings a concept into his intellect and wills it, and then we provide the image that goes with that concept. What does that mean? It means that the demon cannot take images and insert them into your head out of whole cloth. And when I say insert, basically what he's doing is broadcasting. He's willing this image or this concept, and we provide the image. Does that make sense? Everybody with me so far? If not, let's rewind a little. But that's
I'm having a little trouble hearing, I'm sorry.
so this is as good as it gets. Can you come closer. I've got people on it. All right, is that a little better?
I turned a knob.
Is that any better? Okay. All right. So, some of you come closer, some of you go farther. Those with good young ears. So we're talking about the concept of projection, and what that means is the demon broadcast, if you will, a concept, and then we provide the accompanying imagery that goes with it. So he's limited to the stock imagery that is in you, that is inside you. St. Thomas would say in the imagination or the phantasm. So if I say, for instance, if I say unicorn, you're all thinking about a unicorn, but you're not thinking of the same unicorn. So the image is not universal. The demon does not have the ability to project to that degree. He's projecting a concept, you're providing the image. So the question becomes, what is the stock image that you have to work with? Is it sacred art or is it horror movies? What does he have to work with? Does that make sense? Also, the amount of purity, the amount of time it takes you to sift through these concepts and recognize this is compatible or not compatible. This is why we have to practice custody of the mind. St. Thomas says that, and St. Paul both describe these as to capture every thought and make it obey Christ. This is the greeting at the threshold of your thought, your mind, your intellect, every single thought. Is it consistent with the absolute truth that is Jesus Christ? Making sense? Okay. So projection is a very powerful tool. I'll give you two examples of projection. So I'm going to say something, and then we're going to watch how the adversary would work it in a particular group. So how many of you like peanut butter and pickles together? Anybody? No hits? So how many of you are absolutely repulsed by that? How many of you thought about it for a few minutes? So these are varying degrees. Usually I always get somebody that is willing to say, well, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that much, but yeah, that could be a good combination. So then the demon begins to focus on that person, and he will say creamy or crunchy, dills or gherkins. And then we get down into the specificity, and the relationship is formed. Does that make sense? How many times have you been in a place where you got these images of, it could have been random violence, it could have been whatever it is, but it's not your stuff? How many? So often this is in response to a diabolical entity that is active in a particular area. And so, I know my stuff, and if it's inconsistent, we get a lot of it when we're dealing with and interviewing people who are possessed or obsessed, deeply afflicted, when the demon is trying to affect your ability to be present to this person. So that's the concept of projection. So I want you to have that concept and understand that's one of his main weapons. Another one of his weapons is distraction of any kind. And so the distraction often results in confusion. So we have our priorities ordered, and then this moment of distraction happens, and then we lose our priorities. It generally happens to me when I drive by Daylight Donuts. The earlier in the morning it happens, the more effective it is in distracting me. The point is as I'm making my way down through town, I got a pretty good idea where I'm going, what I'm going to do, and then I see that Daylight Donuts. And there's two things to point out here is we have geographical as well as chronological vulnerabilities. Geographical as well as chronological vulnerabilities. What does that mean? Have you noticed that as you drive around, particularly a familiar road, you're thinking about the same people at the same places? Has that clicked for you yet? Negative thoughts at the same place. So we become habituated to external stimuli, and where I'm going with that is we have a multi-sensory filing system. And what multi-sensory filing system does is it joins or cross-references. The importance of that is that's in the memory and emotion interface. So let me draw the faculties. So big I, that's going to stand for intellect, will, memory, emotion. Desires are appetites and instinct. And you may be thinking, what does all this have to do with spiritual warfare or with spiritual combat? This is how the enemy sees us, and this is how the enemy is present to us. St. Thomas describes this, and are there any Thomists among us? If there, I apologize, Father, because this is extremely simplified. We're not going to go into the irascible appetites, the concupiscible appetites. We're not going to go into phantasm and imagination and all that. This is the cowboy version. So this is desire, appetite. So let me describe the faculties, and then we want to talk about how they work. So intellect and will, these are reserved to the soul. So the demon cannot be present to the intellect and the will directly. He cannot possess the soul. If he's allowed to possess, it's to possess the flesh, not the soul. So trick question alert. Who is the prince of this earth? Exactly, Satan, Beelzebub. And so we're going to talk about the difference between who they are. Have we talked about that before? Okay. So intellect and will, this is reserved to the soul. These faculties we share with the angels. They're non-corporal faculties. Now we move down into the body or the corpus. If you visualize this triangle, it is these faculties that the demon can be present to. And so what is the corporal or body, the physical, the flesh element of memory? Where is that? It's in your brain. And why do we say that there's a flesh element to it? Because your memory has a flesh element. If you get a brain injury or various diseases, then your ability to remember or to access a memory file is going to be impaired. And it may or may not get better. So you can organically affect memory. Emotion. Is there what's the physiological tie to this faculty? Tears, laughter, elevated heart rate, blushing. When you experience an emotion, you experience it in your whole body. Well, this emotion memory interface, this is the area where the demon is most active. Is in the emotion memory interface, and he can be directly present to that. Have you ever noticed that whenever you experience something, immediately you're looking for a precedent? When did this happen to me before? That's memory. And then how did I feel about it? That's emotion. So you've got operating here, you've also got the 5 senses. Visualize your body as a dirt suit, a walled city. It's got 5 gates. How open are those gates? So how many of you read food labels before you eat something? Most everybody. How long is that going to stay in your body? Matter of hours, days at the most, right? How much time do you spend before you look at something, before you watch a video, before you look at an image? Well, that's going to be in there 6 to 9 months. And if you reactivate that file, then you refresh it. So this is one of the reasons that it's so important to have a basis of sacred art in your head. Everything is compared to that. Music, or even speech, how protective are we of that gate, that auditory gate of taking stuff in? That has an even longer effect. There are people in here, they'll explain, your mom will explain it to you, your dad will explain it to you. But none of us were born to be wild. So those people laughing, what happens is if you play the opening 5 bars to the song Born to Be Wild, people my age start doing goofy stuff with their body. Often their bottom lip will go into a spasm. That stuff lasts a long, long time. And there's a physical response to that memory and emotion interface. And so just as we did that, how many of you were in your high school yearbook? Yeah, all of us. Whatever it is, there's going to be music or stimuli that'll do the same to you. So for you, it may be years from now when somebody says, dance with my hands, hands, hands. Oh, hit. It's like Battleship. So these things have a multi-sensory connection, and that's the point that I'm making. To purify these, number one, you have to limit the amount of stimulation, what you take in. The other one is to realize that the Mass has something to purify all 5 senses. The sounds, the smells, the sights, the posture, our body posture, all of those things purify our senses. And there was a time in the world when the Mass was the height of your sensory input for the week. It was the most dramatic thing you saw and did for the week. Do you see how much effect it had? This is part of what reclamation theology is talking about. It was extremely important to us to know who was the saint, not just today, but tomorrow, the next day. Who's coming up? What's happening in the liturgical calendar? And not in hindsight, not as it's happening, but ahead of time. This anticipation, this getting ready, this knowledge of the saints, of the liturgical calendar, of the practical function of Feria days to extend the previous Sunday. The understanding, I'll give you a classic example, is this Sunday we start into the countdown to Easter. And so we start a series in the countdown. In the ordinary form, that's lost. They're calling this ordinary time. We're just coming out of the Sundays after Epiphany. What was the purpose of them in the traditional calendar? It was to understand that Christ is made known to the Gentiles through the Magi, and then that realization, His revelation to the world, expands through that whole next week. The first Sunday after Epiphany, we have Holy Family. He's still a babe, but He's up. He's ambulatory. He's out of the crib. He's out of the manger. By Friday of that week, He's baptized, and some important things have happened. Sometime during that week, St. Joseph has died. Sometime during that week, He grows from the child that was found in the temple, the boy in the temple, to someone big enough to go into the desert, meet John, get baptized. Do you see what I mean? Now we're in his public ministry. He's starting to work the signs. The epiphany is continuing. It's spreading. The light in the world continues to grow. And so the traditional understanding of what we were doing runs so much deeper than just showing up to Latin Mass. And I'm not pounding on you guys for doing that. What I'm saying is, it is up to you to preserve the faith and the faithful. Not as a secondary or tertiary activity. It has to be your primary activity. Let me come at it another way. Catholicism is what Judaism looks like if you believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Their liturgy is our liturgy. Their life is our life. So the Orthodox Jew, he's a Jew 24/7, isn't he? Yep. He dresses it, he acts it. You can tell, you can pick him out of a crowd. And if his actions are inconsistent with his dress and with who he purports to be, that makes him a target. Well, guess what? Every one of us has a mark on our forehead that the demon can see. It's the indelible mark of Christ that was given to us at baptism, and we wear it. The demon can see it. So if your actions are inconsistent with that mark, then you become a target. This is how we become known to him. So in this configuration, we're at memory and emotion. We're talking about the memory-emotion interface. The way you purify memories is in light of thanksgiving and the understanding of providence. How many of you have had the experience that when something happened, death of a loved one, loss of a job, whatever it may be, suppression of the Latin Mass, whatever it may be, you're saying that is the worst thing that happened in the moment. 6 months later, a year later, you're saying it's the best thing could have happened. How many? The older you get, the more experiences you have, you recognize two things. Number one, it's all providential. Number two, the quicker you get that shift, the better off you're going to be. The quicker you can go on with life. And so that emotion and a memory interface has to be dialed to bad things have happened to me before. Life-altering events have happened. I've always come out stronger. I will come out stronger. And now we've moved it up into the will. You see how that works? If you choose to go the other way, then you're going to give in to despair and futility. And these are sins against hope, second person of the Trinity. Christ is the embodiment of hope. So this right here is where the battle is really fought, is we have to order our response to God. We have to order our response to absolute truth. Now let's pick up another traditional aspect that we lose. There's been some modernism and relativism that has crept into the Catholic Church, and it's not reserved to the ordinary form. It comes into the extraordinary form. Modernism and relativism is everywhere, sadly. But you have to be able to sniff it out. So one of the hallmarks of modernism and relativism is the anthropomorphication of God. What does that mean? It means to impose upon God human characteristics, such as God wants. God is sad. God is happy. God is not sad. God is not happy. God does not want. God does not desire. God doesn't plan. God wills. Deus vult. God wills. What does He will? Union. Always and everywhere, God wills union. And that is the union between creature and Creator. After the fall, that is salvation. It's the same motivation. It's the same movement. He cannot act outside of that. That is his essence. And so if He wills union, it is that very willing of union that precedes creation. It is that very desire for union that seeks to repair the fall. But His will is constant. How foreign does that sound to our modern ear? It's difficult because it takes us out of the center of the equation and puts God in the center of the equation. You can't give up spatial theology. The obvious conclusion to be drawn from spatial theology is that in your relationship with God, you are either ad orientem or you're ad hominem, ad populum. You're either faced toward Him, toward the Creator, or you're faced toward the creature. And the symbolism and obvious connection is meant because when we turn away from God as being the focal point of the sacrifice of the Mass and turn toward the people, then we've turned away from Creator and we've turned toward creature. In that moment, we're psychologically compatible with the demon. In that moment, because we've elevated creature over Creator. So what we have to constantly do is when we experience an emotion, is it rightly ordered to the absolute truth? Are my memories rightly ordered to the absolute truth? So what does diabolically influenced memories look like? Every time we retrieve that memory, no matter which cross-filing system we use, whenever we retrieve that memory, are we going to look with that as with thanksgiving, or with dread, or with derision, or unforgiveness? You see what I mean? Because if we pull that file with a negative connotation, then we're putting a negative tab on that filing system. We're now giving it modern terms, we've just put a negative hashtag on that memory. And so if we go to it through that hashtag, if we go to it through that association, then we're going to see it in that light. What does this look like practically? How many of you have siblings or know somebody who you lived the exact same childhood and your memory doesn't match theirs? So what happens is if that person is claiming abuse or neglect or a horrible childhood and they were in the same house with you and they're pulling up the same memory file, then they're focusing on different aspects and they've done it for so long they've now deformed the event. And so this is how the diabolical is present. And so the frequency with which, once there's an emotional response, a negative emotional response to a memory, now the demon's going to drive you to that memory. Because in that negative emotional response, he starts you down the cycle toward despair, futility, anger. Does that make sense? So if you can see that cycle, you see you can see his methodology. Now let's go down into the lower attacks, which are no less rare, but they work differently. So the beginning of that cycle is there is offense. Meaning, we perceive an offense. That doesn't mean it's not there, but we have to classify whatever someone's doing as being offensive. So this is where we get into the real practicality. Let's suppose that it is offensive. Let's suppose it's offensive against God. Now this is something that the demon wants you to be absolutely ignorant of. And that is the understanding of power and authority. First of all, power and authority are not synonymous. They are not the same thing. For the Protestant, they are. And so they go back to the Great Commission in Matthew, where he says, go forth, evangelize, proclaim the gospel, baptizing every nation. Who is he speaking to? The apostles. To a Protestant, that means nothing. To us, it means bishop. So let's just use that and apply our Catholic understanding. It says, go forth and proclaim the gospel. Can you proclaim the gospel? Sure. Can you do it on Sunday morning from the ambo during Mass? So there's a restriction. That's called authority. You have the power to proclaim the gospel. Where, when, and how you do it is subject to authority. So when we act outside of our authority, now we're vulnerable. So the question is, what is obligation? What is duty? And right does not confer authority. Huge understanding there is right does not confer authority. You can be right, but this may not be yours to pick up. I'll give you a classic example. How many of you have been in the grocery store and that 2-year-old boy is in the cart? You know that kid. You have the power to spank him. And he needs it. But you don't have the authority. Classic example. And even though you're right and he needs it, what's the chances your action is going to be met with conversion on the part of the mother? None. I'll give you a hint. Do not do that in the canned food aisle. You need to be in a softer aisle like pasta or sugar and paper products. So there has to be this perceived offense, and then there has to be this understanding of, do I have a duty and or obligation? And if I do, what form does that take? So you have to tap the brakes. And number one, you have to say, okay, why am I perceiving offense? If you're perceiving offense because it is attacking these very lower faculties, such as desires and appetites. These are our passions. This is what moves us. This is the thing that makes us really zealous. If it's attacking that, then we have to think, okay, is this consistent with this, what I know to be the truth? Or is it my perception or idyllic projection of what I think the world should be? So we pick up a lot of issues down here and we let them compromise us emotionally. What does this really look like? This really looks like watching CNN. Because anything they say is going to elicit a negative emotional response which will offend you. And then what are you going to do about it?
Turn it off.
After you throw something at the TV. But the point being, you see what's happening. You're being taken out of a place of peace. You're being taken out of a place of spiritual merit. You're being taken off the battlefield. You're being sidelined. And so that's what it looks like down here. Instinct, this is self-image. Included with preservation of corpus is preservation of self-image. And so you'll start hearing things like, that was disrespectful to me. That person's not respecting me. So how do we see ourselves? And so this is when we personalize it as an attack against the integrity of our corpus. So this is the lowest faculty, and it's the one where the demon is the most present. This is the faculty that when you're in the 4th grade makes you absolutely susceptible to the double dog dare. I know because I have succumbed to it.
I dare you.
But this is exactly the way these faculties will initiate or we can find psychological compatibility. I'm stumbling with that. Psychological compatibility with the demon. So there's a perceived offense. And then, how quick is it to go to anger? CNN, 0 to 60 in about 60 seconds. Because there's a perceived offense, there's an emotional appeal, and then we become angry, or we may go straight to rage. What does St. Thomas say about offense, and what does he say about anger? He says that offense is a perceived evil, and he defines evil as a disorder, anything that's not ordered, anything that's not rightly ordered. So the offense is a perceived evil, and that perception can be right or wrong. I mean, it can be an inaccurate perception. And then anger is our inability to properly address the situation. Anger is the response of a man or woman who feels inadequate to address the situation. They can't stop the behavior, they can't stop the situation. Does that make sense? When you see it in that light, you realize that we are Charlie Brown and this is Lucy in the football. We can't not do it. So you have to avoid the near occasion. Now this is where it gets really dangerous. So out of anger, we'll cycle through either despair or futility. And we're going to end at self-harm. And self-harm takes many forms. It can be as simple as saying something you wish you had not said. I know that's never happened to any of us. But that's a form of self-harm, because ultimately when you say that thing, that damages your self-image. It may damage your true image. It'll certainly damage relationships. You ever notice that? And so despair and futility are sins against hope. In order for the demon to be able to pin you, to get the advantage, to get the upper hand, he has to get you to sin. And a lot of times he just backs up enough, he pokes you, and then if he'll step back out of the way, you'll provide the mortal sin. Once you got the mortal sin, now he's got you on the dance floor. And that's where the self-harm is. So let's talk about some methodology to reorder the faculties. The last concept that I'll give you is, St. Thomas says that if this is disordered, then we are by definition insane. We are not functioning correctly. And so we've given up, this is the rational quality, these two together. This is what makes us rational. If we are irrational, then the intellect and will, the soul, is hostage to the flesh. If we are rational, then the intellect and the will are masters of the flesh. What's an example of the rightly ordered person? The martyr. Because the martyr is threatening death, destruction of the corpus. This goes directly against instinct and self-preservation, doesn't it? And he's operating out of the intellect and the will. He is willing to accept this fate in light of what he knows to be true in his intellect. See how that works? So the martyr is rightly ordered. Which of these faculties does society use to the exclusion of the others at this point? Emotion. You can't even find a good Catholic article that doesn't have some type of emotional language in it to elicit an emotional response. We no longer know how to debate. We no longer know how to argue or talk about things in a civil discourse. There's no such thing anymore. It's all about how we feel. And feelings are elevated onto a par with things we know in our intellect. And if we make decisions based on how we feel, then we are de facto insane. Because there are plenty of memories out there that'll tell us when you make decisions in this state, they are not good decisions. But you have to stay up in the intellect and the will. And one of the primary tools to do that is the tool of custody of thought. And you can do this, custody of the senses, but custody of thought is something you can work on every day. And that is this: I will only think about this subject for this amount of time and at this time. Just practice it. Because we in the West, we entertain any thought whenever it shows up. It doesn't matter how deviant, how crazy the thought is, we entertain it. We let it in. You have to meet it at the threshold and say, no, it's inconsistent with my faith. And so for the traditional Catholic, for the Catholic and Reclamation theology, this is the language that is necessary for us to use with ourselves interiorly and with others. And that is, this is either clean or unclean. It's either consistent with our faith or it's inconsistent with our faith. These are statements that we can make out of observation, statements and that keep us up in the intellect and the will. If we start talking about imposing intent or finding other things, we'll very quickly descend out of the intellect and the will. We lose the superiority of the argument or of the statement. Does that make sense? And it's for our own self-preservation. If we got to preserve the faith, we have to preserve it whole and entire. And so we'll get a little bit deeper into this, but I want to talk about the next section. How am I doing for time?
55 minutes. It's been 55 minutes so far.
5-5?
I have 44.
Wow, time flies. Okay. So let's talk about just a little bit about two aspects of being battle ready, if you will. How many of you in your household have, so in this household you are either young people in the household or you are parents in the household? Does that pretty much cover everybody? Okay. So just to verify, are all women here daughters?
Yes.
All men sons? Okay, nobody's exempt. So the concept is that to understand that authority and that power and authority and the difference between power and authority is either of the natural law or it is of the divine positive law, but either way it is operative in the following, is that it's a function of justice and it must flow first vertically before it can flow horizontally. What does that mean in traditional Catholic language? For 19 centuries, the spiritual works of mercy had the primacy over the corporal works of mercy. Do you know what I mean when I say that? The spiritual works versus the corporal works? Modernly, what we see is there is an inversion, not only in the church, but in our thinking. The corporal works of mercy have now surpassed in our own interior desires. They have overshadowed the spiritual works. And so the spiritual works of mercy have come second. So there's a principle here that we have to use. It's a integral, it's a foundational principle, and that is that everything has to operate within the economy of salvation. Everything has to follow the principle of spiritual charity, which serves salvation before it follows temporal charity. Make sense? This is a hard thing for us to get through our head, because most of our sense of justice is because of a horizontal viewing of justice. What do we owe our fellow man? What we owe our fellow man is absolutely irrelevant if you do not discharge what you owe God Almighty. It has to flow vertically before it can flow horizontally. We have to be disposed to grace which flows from God before it can be distributed horizontally. And how does that grace flow? Only through two things, two vocations, marriage and holy orders. All grace flows through the sacrament. All the grace that flows through the sacrament is conformity to God through the church. It's all in this configuration first. The demon wants to pull you out of that flow of grace. He wants you to focus on the horizontal plane rather than the vertical plane. This is ad orientem. This is ad hominem or ad populum. Another way. This is creature focused on creator. This is creature focused on creature. Make sense? Okay. So to do that, we've got two tools. First one is the Ten Commandments. So if you're in combat, the first thing you have to do is survive. Right? So in your first firefight, what you're going to do is you're going to find the lowest, most covered spot you can, and you're going to cower there until the shooting stops. You're not even close to shooting back. You just want to get through it. And then maybe second, third firefight, then you start being aware of what's going on. Then you start returning fire. Spiritual life is no different. Your survival skills are right here. The Ten Commandments. They are the method to avoid sin. They are not a method to gain holiness. Let me say it again. They are a method to avoid sin. They are not a method to attain holiness. You get no merit badge for keeping the Ten Commandments. You don't even get the participant trophy. So this is the minimum level of spiritual fitness that is necessary to engage in spiritual warfare. If you can't carry your pack, if you can't carry your weapon, if you can't dress and lace your boots, what good are you going to be on the battlefield? That doesn't mean you have to be perfect, but what it means is you can't be engaged in habitual mortal sin. So if this is a trick question. So if this is the methodology to avoid sin, basic PT, the very lowest maintenance, now how do we engage in this battle and how do we gain holiness? Prayer's part of it. Beatitudes. So I'm dyslexic. And so when I really get confused, I just get real vague. So when somebody asks me how to spell stuff, I'll say no. Can you spell that? No, I cannot. I'm doing all I can just to say it. So the Beatitudes. So the Beatitudes are prescriptive behavior that leads one to be disposed to grace. Blessed are those who. And then that has to start with an interior movement. How do you get from here to here? So this is how you stop. The Ten Commandments is how you stop vice. The Beatitudes is how you cultivate virtue. Dyslexics of the world, untie. Get it? So, this is what allows us to now order ourselves, keep those faculties ordered correctly, see everything in the light of an economy of salvation, and see ourselves, our actions. Are they beatific? Are they ideal? When you're cultivating virtue and you're working in the Beatitudes, you're pretty much unassailable. If there is an attack, it's seen as an opportunity. So the Ten Commandments, how we vanquish vice. We've got modern prelates, and in our modern world we say, if you want to get rid of a vice, then get the opposite virtue. You ever heard this? If you take that approach, what gets the focal point? The vice or the virtue? The vice. And the virtue becomes an external exercise to suppress the vicious behavior. It doesn't become an expression of an internal desire for beatitude. So this has to come from the inside. The Ten Commandments, that can be exerted exteriorly. And so what I'm getting at is we confess in the Confiteor sins of thought, word, and deed. Right? So the Ten Commandments can work inside or outside in. We can stop the deeds. Then we need to stop the words. Then we need to stop the thoughts. But beatitude is going to come from the inside out. Once you clean that out, now you build back. Beatitude is building. The Ten Commandments are how you chisel away everything that is not the image that you want. They asked Michelangelo, how did you sculpt the David? He said, I took a big hunk of marble and knocked off everything that wasn't David. And so the Ten Commandments are how we get rid of this vicious behavior, start to conform ourselves to God, and then the Beatitudes need to come from the inside out. Thought, word, deed. So let's overlay thought with God the Father, God the Creator, Word, Christ the Son, deed, the Holy Ghost. Go one step further. This is faith, hope, charity. When you see the overlay and you see Christ as the embodiment of the Word and the embodiment of hope, you get a much clearer understanding of His role in the Trinity and exactly what He does. Every bit of grace flows through one event, Calvary. Even the grace, the single act of grace by which the Blessed Mother was conceived, immaculate and without sin, still flows through this moment of sacrificial theology. This is the ultimate psychological compatibility. It is when our will, Christ's will, is in conformity to God's will. That's the ultimate psychological compatibility. Is when our will is in conformity to is conformed to His holy will. If you see your life, your existence, and everything you're doing in light of that, your faculties stay ordered, and then you can recognize any of these deviancies, anything that's not consistent with that. Anything that's not consistent with that is an opportunity for the adversary to act. Are you who you say you are? There was something else I was going to... there's a principle as well. We say it in the Our Father. It's interesting that this is picking up a lot of discussion in the blogosphere and stuff, and it's been attributed to the New Agers and the occultist. I don't know if you've heard it. Hopefully you don't traffic in those circles. But it is the adage that as it was above, so it is below. You ever heard that? As it was above, so it is below. And it's attributed to be a Hermetic statement. Is that not in the Our Father? Isn't that? And so what you see is that it happens, whatever happens here has happened already in the spiritual. It's already happened. Now there's a physical manifestation. You can look at everything in history and you can see it as a movement that started in someone's thought. And then they began to talk about it. And then once they got psychological compatibility and enough people together, then there was the deed. So for Freemasonry, this looks like the French Revolution. Make sense? And so people will often talk about conspiracy. First of all, I am not, when people say, are you a conspiracy theorist? I am no theorist. But what we have to understand is that evil does not need conspiracy. All of these people are motivated by what they think is best for them. Your scriptural example is Saul, who becomes St. Paul. He's got the same amount of zeal, it's now directed correctly. So most of the people have a deformed sense either of themselves, their faculties, what is the good, but they're serving what they think is in their best interest. Tom T. Hall put this in the in a song that most people think about theyself. And so most of the time when we feel offense, remember back when we were talking about feeling an offense, very seldom is someone targeting you. You're collateral damage for the most part. So, this is, I got pretty well exhausted that. How are we for time?
It's been 1 hour.
Okay. So what I'd like to do, it's 1 hour. Let's open this up to questions, discussion, because these are some pretty heavy concepts and I don't want to keep going. This is basic spiritual warfare, and it gives you a way to look at the battlefield, to look at life with some tools, hopefully. So I'd like to hear what you've heard you didn't hear before. Do you have questions? Do you want me to go deeper into a particular topic? So, yes, ma'am.
You used the phrase reclamation theology. What is that?
Okay. She asked, what is the term reclamation theology? So it's something that we made up. But the concept is to reclaim traditional theology. And what is theology? Knowledge of God, knowledge of the faith. And so if you go to www.montecristo.net, there's on that media page, we're now into a subscription phase. And so there's a reflection every morning. So for instance, you will hear about Saint of the Day. If it's a fairy a day, what does that mean? We're moving into the numbered Sundays leading up to Easter. What does that mean? There's so many things in our faith, and one of the problems with modern traditional Catholics is that we don't encounter the traditional liturgy except on Sundays after driving for an hour and a half. And generally that hour and a half is talking about how bad a state the church and the nation is in. And we show up to Latin Mass without a Roman disposition. And we go in, and then we spend an hour and a half on the way home talking about how much better the Latin Mass is than the Novus Ordo Mass. Don't look at me like I'm the only one that does this. So what's happening is the daily observances in our home have disappeared for a large part. The understanding of who the saints were and the fact that they're here among us. And we're not calling on the angels and the saints. They are not going to be present to the crisis or to whatever's going on unless you ask them. Also, to read about them, you realize that this is nothing new. This is the same old shoot 'em up. It's just the first time you've been through it. It's not the first time the church has been through it. It's not the first time that humanity's been through it. Same old shoot 'em up, it's just your first rodeo. And so how did everybody else get through it before? How did they take the times that they were born in providentially and turn them into an opportunity for sanctity? So these little reflections are anywhere from 7-8 minutes up to 15 minutes, and they're every morning. They're on a podcast. You can listen to them multiple times. The other thing it does is it's a subscription. It does two things. It opens the platform up, but it allows Monte Cristo to do a lot of things which are not revenue generating. And that is to be present to priests for consultation, to be present to other people for consultation. We've recorded some programs. Father Ripperger and I have recorded some programs on a Zoom platform for seminarians, on another Zoom platform for formators, people who are doing formation. So it allows us, it funds a lot of the other stuff. So shameless commercial plug. But that's what reclamation theology is. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Grace. How does grace play a part in our salvation? Different types of grace. Is grace quantifiable?
Okay. So, grace. What part does grace play in our salvation? And is grace quantifiable? Is that pretty much the question?
Different types.
And the different. Okay, so let's start with the different types of grace. So, functionally, we talked about all grace flows through Calvary. There is a prevenient grace, or a grace that exists It's a medium. First of all, let's define grace. A functional definition of grace is the medium of communication between a soul and God, between a creature and creator. So if we look at it for the sake of our discussion as a medium of communication. Fair enough? All right. No one's shouting heretic, so I'm going to continue. All right. So this first grace is called actual grace. And you'll hear people say, you can remember that because it's the grace to act. It's more than that. What it is it is the medium of communication that's always present between creature and creator. Because He made you. Because He made you. He has access to you. And only you can deny that. So it starts out as a one-way flow. So functionally, what does that look like? Take you to the 6th chapter of John. Jesus says, no one comes to the Father unless the Father beckons. No one comes to the Father unless He comes through me, Jesus speaking. Do you remember this discourse? He's describing the relationship between actual grace and the grace which flows through the sacrament. So the actual grace is the beckoning. We access it as soon as we realize there is something bigger than us. As soon as we look up, as soon as we realize there's something bigger than us, that we are, now we're open to the understanding that we are creature and something created us. This is the very basis of communication between creature and creator. For people who have fallen away, for pagans, it doesn't matter. They've still got this access. This is Psalm 130, the profundus. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. It doesn't matter where you are. It describes this ability to call out to God, to acknowledge God. St. Thomas would say this is a movement in the will. And once begun, once you hear that the first time, God's going to keep that up. Remember, He wills. And so His will, He's omnipresent. You're just now figuring it out. And so this actual grace draws you to the grace of the sacrament. Now I'm avoiding using the term sacramental grace. I'm purposely avoiding that. A sacramental is not a sacrament. The grace that flows through the sacrament, back to John, no one comes to the Father unless the Father beckons. No one comes to the Father unless He comes through me, Jesus speaking. So what is that? It's through the sacraments. It is that formalized relationship whereby we say, okay, God, you're calling me. Now I'm going to move toward Christ. I'm going to move toward the church. And the sacraments that come through the church. Now for your Protestant brothers and sisters and acquaintances, I'll take you to functional theology, functional Catholicism. Who can baptize? Anybody? Everybody agree? Nope. Yep. How about pagan? How about pagan headhunter in the South Pacific? Yes. What's necessary for the sacrament to be valid? Form and matter. You see how easy He makes it? So you can tell your Protestant brothers and sisters, if you received a Trinitarian baptism by water, you've got the first sacrament. You want the rest of them? There's a set. Come on. What?
Just to clarify, a non-baptized person can baptize another person.
Yep. So the way you look at it is, or the way you read it, is the minister of baptism is not restricted, meaning anyone can do that. It doesn't mean that anyone should do that. Now, we can get off into the minutiae of all of it. We can go as far as the grandma baptism in the kitchen sink without the parents' consent. You guys want to go there? Oh, no. All right, so let's go there because this is functional theology. Does the grandmother, that child, everybody agrees that that child needs to be baptized. Verda? Verda. Does she have the authority? Now you guys, functional theology, that's right. Does she have the power? Yes. So what's the issue going to be? It's going to be valid, but it may not be licit. If it's not licit, who pays the spiritual price for that? The child or the grandmother? Grandmother. The grandmother.
Because she had the will.
Correct. You see how it works? And there's no quicker way to drive that wedge between you and your son-in-law or daughter-in-law all the way in than to say, yep, while you were gone out doing what you were doing, I baptized the kid.
But the baby remains unbaptized.
And the baby remains baptized.
No, unbaptized.
No, the baby's baptized.
Baby is baptized.
Yep. It's valid. It's just not licit.
Doesn't the grandmother also pay a price for not acting on something that maybe should have been done, that was never done? That person then goes to life without ever being baptized? I mean, isn't there a penalty there? And it's a reverse.
So she has no obligation. You remember the discussion about which hill are you going to die on? Do you have a duty? Do you have an obligation? She has no obligation. So here's the beauty of this discussion, is God will not impose obligation where there's not authority. So your obligation is going to flow through authority. The demon's going to want you to feel the prick of an obligation, that soul is your responsibility. And if you don't do it, it's going to fall on you. And that is a spurious, diabolical argument.
So prayer gets into that. So as a father, I have authority over my family to pray for them, but I don't have authority over my friend. So how does that work? I pray for my friend and I pray for my family.
Can't pray the same way. You can pray imprecatory prayers over the minor children in your home and your wife for the length of the marriage. You can't pray imprecatory prayers over your friend. Imprecatory is commanding prayers. And so it follows authority. You may always pray intercessory prayer.
Can you expound on if a grandmother baptizes the child and the parents have no foundation to raise him in a Catholic faith, does then that open up that child to demonic possibilities because the parents aren't doing their rightful duties, so now the baby has been baptized?
We really want it to be that way, but it's not.
Okay.
We can't hold that sword of Damocles over their head.
So the baby,
As much as we would like to, we can't. So here's the thing, is what's necessary in order for it to be licit is consent. And the consent has to be of someone with authority. And the authority over that child is the parents. And so when you parse this out, when you get pulled out of a licit act, now you're open, you're vulnerable.
So does that change when the child then becomes an age of consent and say, Grandma, I want to be baptized? And,
So the baptism is still valid.
right?
Okay, so his petitioning his grandmother is not, he's already baptized. So what you look for,
So let's say she didn't baptize him in the kitchen sink, but, the parents aren't raising the child, but spending time with Grandma, he sees, oh, this is, I want to now be Catholic, and he says,
how old is he?
what is that? So is
9,
that
10.
9, 10?
Got to ask his father's permission.
Okay, so when...
He's still in his father's house.
So when he's not in his father's house.
Okay, but you know what I mean. He's under his father's authority. He's under his father's authority.
Now I'm thinking, now I've got the opposite. I know someone who baptized their father. The father was a lifelong agnostic. Father didn't know it. Did it while he was sleeping. So where does that?
So this falls under the heading of spiritual terrorism. Literally. And so in the adult, it's not valid. So in the baptism of an adult, there has to be consent.
repeat the question?
Yeah, okay, so the scenario is that agnostic father, final act of rebellious revenge of the daughter is to baptize him while he's sleeping. Have I got that right? A little bit of, yeah, a little bit of embellishment on my part. So the question is that valid? So we've got operative principles. You talk about infant baptism where the person receiving the baptism does not have the faculties of reason.
This person had the faculties of reason.
Where there is the faculties of reason, consent of the person is necessary. You see what I mean? Now, there's a couple of exceptions to that. The consent can only be implied in the case of a catechumen and baptism by desire. And so baptism by desire is operative if there's been a public declaration by the individual that they desire baptism. And now they're incapacitated. Make sense? You also can't baptize bodies. You may bless bodies, but you can't baptize bodies. And so all of this, it's an excellent discussion. There's another element that's present or needs to be present. We talk about baptism being the prerequisite sacrament, but there's another sacrament that's necessary for all the others. Do you know what it is? Confession. All the other sacraments are, and baptism for that matter, confession is necessary. In the case of an infant, it would be the parents and the godparents who are asking for the sacrament to be conferred on the child. Does that make sense? So the other thing about baptism in the bathtub or baptism in the kitchen sink is these provisions for anyone can baptize are in the case of necessity, in the case of emergency. So rightly done, the grandmother, the child is in danger of death. There is whoever that minister is baptizes. But if this child is more than 8 or 10 days old and is not baptized, and the parents don't have one scheduled, then you can't imply consent. You can't infer consent on their part. You see what I mean?
You can or cannot?
Cannot. And so let's do two scenarios. One is there's no implied consent. The other one is grandmother is watching the child. He's 6, 7 days old. They've gone to a doctor's appointment. He begins to choke. She hurries up and she baptizes this child. If the child gets past this episode, colic, choke, whatever it is, then as soon as the parents come back, she says, hey, I did this. Let's all go to Father. They go to Father and they say, Father, here's what I did. He's going to ask about 5 questions to make sure that matter and form and consent are all present. And then he's going to enter that baptism in the sacramentary. That's the right use of emergency baptism. That's the right use of parents not being there to give consent at the moment of baptism. You see what I mean? Anything else is a deviation. And then to the extent the deviation, this is why you've got to go to the priest and say, I baptized my grandchild in the kitchen sink. Number one, we want to know, is it valid? Number two, can we enter it into the sacramentary? Why is this an issue? Because we are going to deal with that person as a possessed or obsessed person 30 years down the road. The demon always challenges the sacraments. He will challenge the validity and the illicitness of every single sacrament. Even for the person confirmed. Did you go to confession before you were confirmed? Did you confess every sin? I mean, this is where he's poking. It doesn't mean that his arguments are right, but this is what he's raising up in this person's mind, and there's a psychological compatibility. The person now begins to doubt the validity or illicitness of their sacrament.
Saying
And
if the parents were in mortal sin, and they brought their child in for a baptism, that it's not valid?
no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that is a requisite. That's plan A. You deviate from plan A, then this leads into your next question. Is grace quantifiable? Yeah. And so there's impediments to grace. Plan A is grandparents come on both sides, godparents come, parents come, everybody is freshly confessed. They knock on the door. This is the old rite. First exorcism is at the door. There's 3 exorcisms in that formula. One at the door, one at the narthex, and one at the font. If you're looking at maximum flow of grace possible through the sacrament, then you've got to tick off the boxes.
So that was going to be my question, is validity and efficacy. I was baptized as a Protestant, and then I was confirmed as a Catholic, but I didn't get all those exorcisms, my kids didn't get those things, so they're validly baptized, but they don't have, the souped up.
Okay, so here's the best parallel I can draw with that. The guy that gets the lowest grades in medical school, what do they call him?
Doctor.
It's it's what you do with it. It literally is what you do with it. And so now we augment the flow of grace. We want to concentrate on what we didn't get rather than what we can do with it. So, you put 15 cents in the pocket of an immigrant who's willing to work, that's all they need. You put 15 cents in the pockets of an immigrant that's not willing to work, he's insulted. Same 15 cents. Same 15 cents. So everybody gets a running start. And through your path through the sacraments, this can become as big a conduit as you want it to become.
Is that the same for Mass then? Is that the same for Mass?
Yes. Yep.
Simply a valid Novus Ordo versus a grand Latin, beautiful.
High Mass.
So it's the difference between sucking water out of a rag and standing on the banks of the mighty Mississippi. It's all water. It'll keep you alive. But it's
What happens to someone who is not baptized, who hasn't heard the word or hasn't chosen to accept the word?
okay.
What happens to them?
So these are different categories. So the question is, what happens to the unbaptized, someone who hasn't heard the word or who hasn't chosen to hear the word? Those are all different categories, so let's just kind of parse through them. And this is reclamation theology. The first premise is we don't have to make that call. That's not ours to pick up. Unless that person is under our authority, it's not our call. In other words, we don't have to make a disposition of what happens to their immortal soul. Here's the premise. Here's the concept. God is bound to the sacraments. He is not bound by the sacraments. And so there's the foundational statement, is that God is bound to the sacraments. In other words, if you go to the church, hit the rubric, do the sacrament, then God will honor that. But His relationship with that soul may be outside anything we understand. Because He made them.
So
And-
hearing that you have to be baptized to go to heaven is not necessarily true then?
What I'm telling you is that's what we know, and so we're bound by what we know. We are not bound by what we don't know.
Okay.
And so reclamation theology says that once you hear it, I used to play this trick on my confirmation class. You guys in confirmation class? Good. So this won't come as a surprise. So I'd ask them, I say, how many of you know it's a mortal sin to miss Mass? Well, now you all do. So that willing ignorance is gone. Now that you know it, now we're bound to it. So that goes to the question, the person who hears the name of Christ. Now they've got to make a decision. Hearing about the incarnation, understanding that God would become man, this was the occasion for the fall of the angels. This is everybody. This happens to every creature. You will either accept this or you won't. So once you hear that name that is above all names, then you got to make a decision. And then you answer for that decision. Incidentally, does anybody know that's the real reason that Columbus came? There was the intelligence, or the information came back that there was a new world and it was populated. Ferdinand and Isabella, At that time, one of the theologies that was in vogue was that once every creature on earth had heard the name Jesus Christ, He would come again. And that's what fueled it. Letters between Ferdinand and Isabella and their courtiers say, we're willing to empty the treasuries of Spain so that every person hears this name. These should be saints. This is a Freemasonry history rewrite. And so to go back and to understand, that's what was fueling that whole thing. So that has, with regard to your questions, they're good questions. Knowing what we know the value of baptism because that takes out the question. So from a conversion and an evangelization standpoint, we have to share the faith. What we have to share the faith is, if you are baptized and you wear the indelible mark of Christ, you become a child of God. That is your ticket to particular judgment. Functional theology. I'd rather have a hearing, a chance, an opportunity to cry mercy, mercy, than none at all. So, hopefully that addressed the question.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, sacramental grace comes through the bishops, right? To the priest, sacramental grace?
The grace of the sacrament, of all the sacraments, comes through the actual sacrament itself. So you've got 3 sacraments of initiation. And the necessity is to go to confession before each one. So if actual grace is that medium of communication, then the grace which flows through the sacrament provides 2 things. It does 2 things. It leads you to vocation, and then it gives you the grace to fulfill state of life, to make good on the vocation. All of that is under sacrificial theology. It is the grace to pursue vocation. Once you're fully initiated into the church, now you're ready to join the church militant. You do that by entering vocation. This is something that we really need to work on, because when you go to places where the faith is being practiced vibrantly, kids are sure by the time they're 10 years old which way they're called. You don't have a plethora of millennials, 30-year-old millennials discerning on your couch. St. Alphonsus says that a vocation delayed is a vocation denied. He says, pick. The blessing's not in the choice, the blessing's in the commitment. And the grace of the sacrament is what gives you the strength necessary to fulfill and make good on sacrificial theology through either vocation, to fulfill your state in life. Make sense? Now we come to, so there's 3 kinds of grace for the Catholic. There's actual, sacramental, and sanctifying. So sanctifying grace is that which makes us attractive to the Holy Ghost. So the Holy Ghost is the 3rd person of the Trinity. What is His theological virtue? What is His attribute? Charity. Charity. Right? To work in the economy of salvation. So all the way down to here, we're doing 10 Commandments stuff. Now we start moving into beatitude. So this is where heroic virtue is. This is where merit is. Make sense?
Filling your hands with graces and things that you do. So they won't be empty when you die.
One way to say it, yep. How do indulgences? So our indulgences are earned according to our state of grace, and so our state of life. And so our indulgences have to be right ordered to our state of life. For instance, a man doing manual labor who decides he's going to engage in physical mortification and it impairs his ability to feed his family or make a living, that indulgence that's a disordered indulgence. The woman who decides she's going to spend 8 hours a day praying for the dead and doing physical mortification and has 3 small children at home, that's not going to work. So a big thing about indulgences is it has to be ordered to the state in life, and then you earn sanctifying grace through the earning of the indulgence, not the indulgence itself. The indulgence itself has most efficacy and value when it's applied to the holy souls in purgatory, or more still when it's given to the Blessed Mother to do with what she will.
Is sanctifying grace earned, or is it a free gift? You just use the word earned.
So you have to be in the right location. If I'm giving away free $100 bills, I'm not going to mail it to you. You got to show up. And so, and it's still free, but you got to be here. And so when I'm talking about it being earned, I mean you have to be disposed and in the right place. Yep. Yeah, it's still gratuitous. I mean, you can show up every day at my house for the $100, and if I don't come out on the porch, no $100. And then that one day I come out there and you ain't there, that was the $100 bill day. But yeah, that's what I mean by, thanks for the opportunity to clear that up.
Mr. Clement, so in your IWMEDAI, the intellect is at the top.
Yes.
So this is reserved to the soul. So I know your formation is essential in forming that intellect, right? So that we can operate out of that lower sphere and more into the high sphere, right? So what obligations do we have as far as formation for that, other than obviously attending Mass?
So that's a great question. So the moral theologians, and incidentally, if you want to source on moral theology, it's Prumer's Handbook of Moral Theology. And so essentially, the Catholic obligation is not that you have to amass knowledge, not that you have to understand and be able to explain the metaphysics of the doctrines and dogmas. You simply have to assent to them. But here's the hard part for Catholics, is that if you do take in information, it has to be consistent with the deposit of the faith. That's a really important thing, is you may remain as ignorant as you wish. But if you choose to take in information, then it has to be consistent with the deposit of the faith.
It's difficult when your priest or some of your hierarchy are telling you stuff that maybe isn't consistent.
Yeah.
And then you have to differentiate between what is a part of that deposit and what isn't.
Yeah, so this is going to be the obligation of the laity, and you bring up a really, really good point. This is the obligation of the laity, and it's only by the reaction of a subordinate that a superior is formed. And so it's this understanding, I'll do this, but I won't do that. I'll give you a classic example. We're much better at this than we think we are. So the issue is power and authority, and how it relates to obedience. So the scene is Jesus before Pilate. And he says to Pilate, the power you have over me comes from above. Remember this? And Jesus submits himself to the authority of Pilate even unto death. Everybody's got that. Pilate is nowhere near on a par with Christ or in any way superior to him other than in a providential place of authority. And Jesus is obedient unto that, even unto death. So I want to ask you a question. What if Pilate had said to Jesus, then fine, offer sacrifice to the Caesar? Would Jesus have done that? It took you no time to sort through that theological question, and you're absolutely right. So if Jesus is obedient even unto death, why would He not sacrifice? Because that's against morals and theology. There's always the test. If it is against morals and theology, then it exceeds right use of authority, and we owe no obedience. In fact, to obey militates against the economy of salvation. You see it?
So, there are some Catholics I know, faithful, obedient, that heard, bishops and the Holy Father was saying they needed to be vaccinated. And then other Catholics that are like, no, this goes against my conscience because of, aborted fetal tissue and all this kind of, and this stuff. But some feel in order to be obedient that they needed to take this injection. Others felt, so where do you get your information to discern, is this a matter of obedience or is this a matter of,
So-
going against
so-
morals and...
So what I'm about to say,
Repeat the question?
Is really gonna be the big one.
so the question is, it's about functional obedience, and the example is with regard to the vaccine, when you've got bishops and the Holy Father speaking the way they speak about the vaccine. So let's go to the specific language. And so obedience is only activated at command. We are not charged to be obedient to suggestion. And these guys know that. So they use the concept of obedience as a bullying and an intimidation tool. They're not commanding you to get the vaccine. So a command, remember with the church, all obedience, disobedience has with it to bind under penalty of sin. So the question is, does this bind under penalty of sin? So when we started to ask those questions to those prelates, they retreated very, very quickly. Because that's a canonical test. Does it bind under penalty of sin? Think about it with your kids. You're raising your kids and you say, I'd really like for you to pick up your room. That's going to be the first one. They don't do it. Then you're going to say, 2 weeks grounding. Now you see the penalty? So there's no penalty. So what happens is there's this intimidation and bullying, and there may be a penalty exacted. No promotion, you'll be asked not to do parish ministry, Dallas Protocol, all kinds of stuff. But bottom line is, did they put penalty of sin? Only then is it officially something that is subject to obedience. Let's suppose they did say this binds under penalty of sin. Then what you're going to need to do is talk with your husband, talk with the other part of your vocation. Nobody's in vocation by themselves. Priests are in it with other priests. They're in it with their bishops. We're in it with our husbands and our wives. This is a discussion because this can't divide households. It cannot divide households. Then at the end of the day, you're going to do what you're going to do based on morals and theology. If you think you're being asked to do something that is against your morals and your theology. But here's the ultimate test. After all the discussion and everything else, you're going to stand at particular judgment and you're going to look into the eyes of the Sacred Heart and you're going to defend what you did or did not do. So whatever decision you make sure that when it's just you and the Sacred Heart at particular judgment, you don't have the power of subpoena, you don't have the power of accusation, you can't pull Flip Wilson theology, the devil made me do it. You can't do any of that. It's just you and him and you're looking into his eyes. Can you defend your decisions?
Does the Pope have the authority to cancel the extraordinary form of the Mass?
He does. Yep, he sure does.
Can you expound on custody of Paul? How does that
Say it again.
Can you expound on custody of thought?
Custody of thought. Expound on the custody of thought. So the custody of thought is you determine the subject matter that enters. The will is the gatekeeper. And so you, by your will, say, I will entertain this thought or I will not. I will consider this particular subject or I will not. So have you ever consciously decided, I will not look at my phone until after I do this? That's a way to do it. Have you also noticed that you have this temptation to look at your phone right before you go into Mass? Or right before you go into adoration, or right before you do something? This is distraction. Don't do it. Airplane mode is a great blessing. Or just not to have it with you at all. But if you can start regulating your phone, then you can start regulating your thought in the same way. Just, I'll pick it up or I won't pick it up. So the analogous thing to airplane mode is Blessed Mother mode. Put your brain in Blessed Mother mode.
I'm just saying it's hard to be intentional with your thoughts throughout the day. So,
But it's very necessary, and it's something that can be cultivated. For instance, like in a monastic situation, if you've ever been around monastics, they answer the bell. And so when the bell rings, even if you're mid-sentence in reading a book, just shut the book. You have to have that kind of discipline. You literally have to have that kind of discipline. And once you start doing that, it'll become easier.
So for children, since there are children here, and I have a couple in here, regarding custody of thought, they may not have devices, but they can get distracted from their schoolwork or distracted from being at Mass or whatever chore they're attending to. How do we help cultivate that? Is it, like stopping for prayer for the Angelus or, that kind of stuff?
Two ways. So how do you cultivate custody of the mind, custody of thought, especially in young people, and for us for that matter? How many of you are able to sit completely through the Mass with no distractions? Excellent. It's extremely difficult to do. Have you tried cutting it into increments? Prayers at the foot of the altar. Aspergeus May. Don't turn the page. Stay right there. Have you tried that? So incrementally is much, much better than in a totality. So to look at practicing custody of the thought or thinking about a particular subject, do it incrementally and in smaller. If you can master your mind for 5 minutes this week, then we'll go to 10, then we'll go to 15. And so that's a way to build that discipline and that attribute. The other one is set some alarms on your clock. The best way to do this is the Angelus, 6 noon 6. And whenever it goes off, you pray the prayer. And if you're on the phone with somebody, just let them know, hey, my Angelus just went off. You can pray it with me or wait 5 minutes, either way.
What if you're already praying? Because my 6 o'clock, I'm already up. I haven't had breakfast. Trying to read my office, the condensed version, and the 6 o'clock bells go off. Do I stop?
You bet. You got to give something the priority, the primacy. You got to give, something's got to be the fire bell in your life, that you drop everything and you answer that.
I hope this question isn't off the course, but what are the sins against the Holy Ghost and are they forgivable?
Okay. What are the sins against the Holy Ghost and are they forgivable? Scripture says they are not. So what is that context and what specifically are they talking about? So let's suppose you're my doctor and I'm an oncology patient. You're my cancer doctor. And you say, okay, you have cancer of the earlobe. For me, that's a significant concern. So, and so then you say, hey, we've got a cure. It's 100% effective. You have to take this pill. The side effect is it will give you a headache. And I say, I will not take it. So that's the denying of the charity. I won't extend it to myself, nor will I extend it to anyone else. So these are the sins that prevent the Holy Ghost ex operando by their operation from acting because He will not impose His will on you. Does that make sense? And so it's not something that's really mysterious, technicality. You get the sins against the Holy Ghost stamp when you show up at the pearly gates and they say, get out of here. It doesn't work like that. It's a denial of the Holy Spirit, of the Holy Ghost, and of the charity that He's trying to extend to you.
Is the assumption that you're going to go to heaven a sin against that? Like the Protestants think they're all going to heaven?
So presumption is a different sin. It's not a sin against the Holy Ghost, but it's a sin. The presumption is a sin.
I've been baptized, so I'm saved, and so it doesn't matter what else I do.
So that doesn't square with our theology. And so the best thing to do is just, number one, wait for them to ask you the question, and just very simply, it doesn't square with our theology. And if they push you, just look them in the eye and say, I eat His flesh and drink His blood, and that's what I'm counting on. That pretty well quails the apologetics discussion.
Well, I'm telling them too that they have to pay a price for their sins, that it's like the little kid that breaks the neighbor's window. The neighbor may forgive him, but then the child has to atone by paying for the new window and fixing it and whatever. And when you explain that to them,
So how many of you converted with that? It's a great story, but how many of you converted?
not yet, but I'm working on it.
I admire your zeal, but your weapon is they quit listening to you. And so I think this is a big part of apologetics is we are willing to engage in apologetics, and they're not really wanting an answer, they're wanting an argument.
Well, I got the whole rapture thing from her, so.
So Father and I had an idea with regard to the rapture. We're going to sell rapture insurance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Yeah. Somebody's got to take care of the pets, the boats, everything that's left behind. So.
Concerning custody of thought, your example with the telephone is very concrete. That would be, to me, a much easier use of the will not to look at the phone and leave it in the car before Mass. But there are many more subtle types of thoughts that involve the imagination. That, to me, is much more difficult to control than those types of examples you were giving. When does that, say, an impure thought comes into your mind? At what point does that temptation start being entertained through the imagination, and how to cope with that?
So when it's a great question. It's when you start to entertain, let's talk about entertaining. It's when you start the interior conversation. When you start thinking about it beyond the concept. When you start talking about implementation. So I'll give you another example is when anybody talks about one of the symptomologies of diabolical affliction, they have suicidal ideation. What I go to is immediately, tell me how far down that path you've gone. And so just starting down that path is, I don't want to live here, I don't want to live anymore. That's just basic conceptual. If they're all the way down to, I'm going to do it in my Aunt Millie's closet at 3:30 on Tuesday afternoon with Uncle Bob's tie, now we got some serious issues because they've entertained the thought all the way from concept to the specifics.
All right, what about on that continuum? At what point does that become sin?
When you think about it, once you recognize this is sinful, this is wrong. Once you make that clean versus unclean, that's when you have to discard it. So
anywhere else on that continuum, you've already committed that sin.
To some degree, may not be to a mortal degree, but you've taken in the unclean. Another good example is you pull the Tupperware out of the refrigerator, and you peel the top off, and it's blue and fuzzy. How long are you going to look at that? How long are you thinking, if I take the top layer off with a spoon? Yeah. So you need to chunk the container and the deal. When I was in college, microwave ovens first came out. I had a roommate that thought that microwave took care of that. Yeah, if you microwaved it, it's all good. Hopefully that addressed the question. Yeah.
When does power become authority, and also the other way, when does authority collapse into an abuse of power?
Okay, so authority never becomes power. Power never becomes authority. They are two separate things. And so St. Thomas says that power is the ability to affect change. Authority is the right to affect change. And a right comes out of an obligation. So, obligatory with your office, for instance, let's say you're a father of children, then your ability to command, your right to command, is based upon the obligation that you command them in a way that's consistent with God's will. Does that make sense? So when you see authority as being something that must be discharged, it's not something to be grasped. It's something that must be discharged, and it's a function of the office that the person occupies. Doesn't have anything to do with merit. So it's a function of the office that they occupy. Now the power is what affects the change. If it comes from God through the divine positive law, again it flows through the office. So power is not is abused more in the neglect. It can be abused in the overuse, but authority is more often abused in the neglect. Meaning people will not discharge the authority that they're obliged to discharge. Does that make sense? And so when you see it that way, then you see that authority is both an upline and downline relationship. We have authority, we have the obligation to subject ourselves to right authority and to discharge right authority to those below us. Make sense? Did that answer? If it didn't, take me back.
I guess the specific example I'm thinking of is a conquering nation, for example, that overpowers another nation and takes control and then becomes the legal authority.
Okay, so remember that all power and authority flows out of justice. So if you're in an unjust situation, you can't make it just. This is
the foundation of the United States of America are rebel against the authority of Great Britain.
So this is not a Catholic country. This has never been a Catholic country. Rebellion is not a Catholic principle. It's hard to hear. It's hard to hear. So, give you an example of an unjust situation. How many of you are aware that there are thousands of frozen embryos in this country? What is the just disposition of those embryos? How do you impose that? Okay, their mother's not open to that. So what are you going to do with these embryos? Woman has 20 frozen embryos. Are you going to force her to take on 20 pregnancies?
Give them a proper burial.
How many of you think that solution is lacking? All of us. Because all solutions will be lacking. The point being made is that they are here as a result of an unjust act. There's not going to be a just response. So once you step off into the realm of the unjust, oftentimes there is not going to be a just response. You can't get there from here. Because we already departed plan A when we allowed it. And so now the consequences that flow from it, we often find ourselves in unjust situations or conundrums or points of peril that the only opportunity to address it was before we entered it. And then once you're in it, there's no real just way out of it.
Once you're in it, you step in it.
To some extent, yeah. Does that make sense? Say again?
There's no answer?
There's no just answer. Because all justice flows from God. Is their existence an affront to God? Is it an offense? Meaning, is it against creation as God created? Yeah. So conception is supposed to occur where? Even more where? in the sacrament of matrimony. So again, functional theology says this is plan A. And then we got to realize that we're dealing with plan B, C, D, L, M, N, O, P. We're dealing, very seldom do we deal with plan A.
So from that, because we do have so many A, B, C, D, E, F, all of that, then because there's no just response, we're operating on a dysfunctional.
So even though it's not, the only response that can be made is stop the activity.
If it's possible.
They make money doing it.
Well, not just that, but there's also, children born out of wedlock. And
Well, you understand all that, but how do we stop the activity? So we maybe can only stop it in Catholics. So how do we stop the activity?
reconciliation.
So when he tells you that contraception and IVF and all of that stuff is inconsistent with our Catholic faith, he's not saying that's wrong. He's saying it's inconsistent with our Catholic faith. Now you know why it's inconsistent. It creates situations out of which there's no just response. The whole purpose of theology and functional theology in our faith is to maintain a reconciled relationship with God. It's not to institute penalties. It's just simply to say, if you go here, there be monsters, danger. Don't go here. And then we have to take that counsel and order our lives accordingly. But we have to be docile enough to take the counsel.
Docility. To take counsel, docility.
Docility is the virtue by which one seeks and takes counsel. How are we for time?
5 o'clock.
All right.
I think my grace pool is getting about 3/4 full. Doing all right.
Cool. Excellent. All good? Any burning questions?
You said in the beginning images, you were talking about images, and that demons are most active or we're most vulnerable in the memory, emotions, desire, appetite, and instinct, and that it can take 6 to 9 months to make it go away unless we reactivate that. So how does that, so that's pictures, movies, sound, music, does that?
So remember when we talked about, you said, what is the obligation of the Catholic with regard to gaining knowledge? It's not that we have to gain knowledge, but what knowledge we do expose ourselves to has to be consistent with the Catholic faith. That's done through imprimatur. It's done through nihil obstat. It's done through good counsel. And so when we take in things that are inconsistent with our faith, then this is problematic. Yes, ma'am.
You can ask your guardian angel to protect you with that, correct?
He's not going to protect you. He's going to suggest to you.
Yeah.
And so, we wave him off all the time. So that little twist of conscience, we have a built-in BS meter, a Catholic conscience. When it goes off, listen to it.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile with Padre Pio's angel driving home in his car?
Easy. Padre Pio had a life different than me and you, brother.
If you could give the younger member of the audiences just something they don't need with anything else, just
Say it again.
tidbits of advice for the younger members of the audience, just some tidbits of advice.
Be holy. Get holy or die trying. Make it your number one priority is to be Catholic or not at all. Remain pure in thought, word, and deed. Because there is no career, there's no honor, there's no accolade, there is nothing that compares to sisterhood or motherhood. Either way, pick a direction and go.
So So choosing not to marry, because he said the graces are flowed through either the holy orders or the sacrament of matrimony. So deciding to stay single, is that not?
So traditionally, that was not considered a legitimate vocation. And here was the exceptions to that. So I'll give you some exceptions. Is to understand that grace flows through sacrament. It flows through vocation. So you will receive grace either through the marriage that you are a fruit of, or you will receive grace through a vocation once you join a religious order or get married. Does that make sense? And so here was the exceptions to what I'm saying, is that if someone at the end of a married life, when they found themselves widowed, they would affiliate with a religious order as a third order. There used to be secular tertiaries of third orders, which allowed you to live, but you were out in the secular, but you were under authority. You were living vows of poverty and chastity and purity. Your earnings were going to support the order, or they were in turn supporting you. But there was an authority structure. So the danger is that in single people who are outside of a household, there's no authority structure. No spiritual authority structure. So that's why traditionally that never was. Post-Vatican II, they recognized the consecrated state of singles. All good? Excellent.
As much as I can absorb.